Morning, folks. Welcome to the first response to the first weekly readings. This week, it's Max Stirner, The Ego and Its Own, with the introduction, All Things Are Nothing to Me. In this reading selection, Max Stirner lays out his basic thesis on the ego and on the general ideology known as egoism. Stirner's central premise is that certain hegemonic ideologies, such as religion or humanism, both stem from the same egoist pattern that accompanies all forms of thought. For instance, God's concern is mainly with God, and humanity is with humanity, the nation with the nation, the prince with the prince, etc. What I find most interesting about Stirner's conception of the ego is this does not seem to comport directly with individualism. I was expecting the ego to be another form of saying individual, but it seems the way Stirner uses the term ego, he uses it to describe various collective organizations. Take, for example, God, who he says is said to be the all in all, as well as truth and other various conceptions that have come to be associated with God, or at the very least the term God. Can the all in all, the entire universe, as well as various conceptions of truth and justice and ethics, really be said to be contained in an individual? In other words, can God be said to be an individual? I don't think Stirner would agree that God can be an individual, but he seems to believe that God can be an ego, the same way he finds that humanity, as well as humanism, and nations and nationalism all have their various egos, despite not being actually material flesh and blood individuals themselves. Thus, the ego seems to transcend the individual, but I will have to take into account how Stirner then uses the term ego throughout the rest of the work. It is, for the record, I have not read the entire work. I am reading it, and then as I read each part publicly, I then make these responses. That's just how it goes. So anyways, if it turns out that through the rest of the book, Stirner uses it in an individualistic context, I'll have to keep that in mind and wonder why individuals can have egos but collectives cannot, when in his thesis, his opening statement, he seems to believe that the ego can apply to all sorts of quantities and groups and concepts that are not simply just individuals pursuing their own interests. I find the conception of the ego as the creative nothing out of which everything comes, bordering on pure solipsism. I have no clue of what Stirner thought of solipsism, but if he describes the self, or the ego, as the creative nothing from which all other things come forth from, then it would appear that everything is merely background decoration to the experience of the ego, implying the ego is all that is real and all that, and then once the ego dies, everything else goes with it. But furthermore, I would like to bring up an objection to this idea brought to me by Mathema, who said, "I've always found this text to be a weak case for egoism, mostly because Stirner starts talking about himself as nothing. A reductio against the coherence of his position seems almost obvious. 1. I am only concerned with myself. 2. I am nothing. Therefore, I am concerned with nothing. This seems to even preclude concerns with his own egoistic desires." I find that to be a rather, by the way, unquote. I find that to be a rather brief but brutal decimation of Stirner's thesis And I find that the only wiggle room Stirner would have out of that is the vagueness in which he uses the term nothing in this opening chapter. This introduction. Stirner casts his self as the creative nothing out of which all things around him come forth. At the risk of sounding like G-Man, it almost seems that like Max Stirner is making himself his own god. Again, I would have to read on to know specifically what Stirner means by the creative nothing. But again, this notion of the self as that which all other things come out of comes very close to solipsism. To end this response, I would like to address the nihilistic tone which permeates the entire piece but comes up most strongly in the last few sentences, where Stirner asks what is good and what is bad, and then notes that neither have any meaning for him, because he is his all in all, and that he is neither good nor bad. This a tone most popular at the end of the First World War, and the view that most believe to be the bedrock of Nietzschean philosophy, is what inspired me to start this series with this particular piece. Of course, I, coming from what I call the moralist community, believe that a strict right and wrong, governed by what I would call God, dictates ethical human behavior. Please note, God in this sense is not being used in literal terminology. So as I read the rest of this work, I will keep note of how the nihilistic, how do I say this? Virtueless, screw it, that's not a word, but you know what I mean. How that lack of an ideology permeates the thinking of Stirner. Not much else to say, so I'll just round up the response by saying, looking forward to seeing you in the next part of this reading, and have a good day.